British North America was linked into an increasingly globalized market. It was an economy that funneled raw materials from the hinterland to growing colonial urban centers. From there, they made their way across the Atlantic Ocean to the newly industrializing core of European empires. Moreover, the American colonies were not the only source of raw materials that fueled the industrializing economy. South Asia and Africa contributed as well. Today, we will examine the Atlantic system and the role of the North American colonies in it. Our objectives are to understand the development of the Atlantic system, identify agricultural practices and markets, and examine early urbanization in colonial America. Early modern Europe began with the Renaissance, a rebirth of classical knowledge in Italy, which then spread north throughout the region. Europeans recovered knowledge that they had long lost as Rome fell to waves of Germanic migrations. When it did, Europe ceased to be a major center of innovation and trade. Instead, it took a back seat as the Umayyad and later Abbasid empires became a culture hearth of cutting-edge knowledge and technology. Europeans wanted to regain their edge. To do so required severing their dependence on the Middle East as the intermediary of goods flowing from Asia and Africa. It meant reorganizing their economic world. As they explored, Europeans established colonies along the littoral regions of North America, South America, Africa, and South Asia. They organized their imperial economies in a mercantilist system. Mercantilism sought to increase national wealth by establishing a closed economic system. In North America, colonies extracted valuable fur pelts by trading with Native American hunters or by sending European fur trappers into the heart of the continent. There they became deeply entrenched in an extensive global trade network where shells and fur from the northwest, turquoise and valuable metals from the southwest were exchanged in the Great Plains for goods coming from the eastern tribes. This was a trade system that had existed for well over 1,000 years. European manufactured goods, including arrowheads, muskets, and cloth, became important trade items in this system. From there, they were shipped to Europe aboard ships manufactured and manned in New England. Once they were transformed into manufactured goods by European craftsmen, they were once again worked their way into the market, possibly to Africa or back to the colonies themselves. The idea was to guarantee that the colonies produced for the empires and did not act as rivals. Of course, it is also important to note that mercantilism was an economic system favored by the imperial citizens. Like Rome, empires consider persons born within the homeland as possessing of all the economic and political rights. Colonists, on the other hand, were treated as second-class societies and economies. Initially, British North Americans accepted this. The 1800s were a time of trials as the British fought to establish colonial footholds and expand them. For Virginia colony, this process took almost 40 years. In that time, they lost a large number of colonists to the Starving Times, followed by 2 wars against the Powhatan Confederacy. New Englanders did not fare much better. They too lost many of their initial colonists. Within the same period, they fought first in the Pequot War of 1636, followed by King Philip's War in 1675. The middle colonies fared slightly better, largely owing to slightly different strategies. For example, in the Quaker colonies of Pennsylvania, William Penn desired to establish firm, fair treaties with groups like the Delaware natives. This bought them quite a bit of goodwill when it came to their indigenous neighbors. Of course, there were also imperial wars fought against France, Spain, and the Netherlands. By the 1700s, this reliance on Great Britain for protection dwindled with each English victory over their rivals. The colonies also strained as their societies stabilized and grew. As more peaceful and secure colonial society attracted artisans who helped increase industry. By the mid-1700s, they were chafing at British mercantilist laws. They desired a system that allowed competition. By the beginning of the American Revolutionary War, the colonies had become fertile ground for ideas that Adam Smith proposed in 1776, the same year that American pamphleteer Thomas Paine viewed as the times that try men's souls. As stated, colonies were the centers of extractive industry connected to a broader system. Much of the agricultural activity depended on soil, climate, location, and culture. For example, New England and parts of the middle colonies were areas of predominantly small farm production. Culturally, this was understandable, as each family in New England was considered a little commonwealth. Everything within their society essentially revolved around the family. Also, their ancestors began practicing subsistence agriculture in the early days. Simply trying to establish a foothold, they had not developed markets for their crops in the early 1600s. By the 1700s, many farmers continued to produce for their families, but they also produced for the market. This continued to be a common characteristic of farmers in this region throughout the 1800s, often even using their skills to earn extra money engaging in non-agricultural work. In essence, New England went from subsistence farming to commercial agriculture, but always remaining as primary economic activities. The southern colonies were different. With longer summers and more mild winters, they could plant cash crops not fitted to the northern climate. Rice, indigo, tobacco, and later cotton, as well as staples, did well there. They quickly adopted to plantation agriculture as large landowners sought to produce commercial crops for the larger market. They fused this with the slave society following Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, when they increasingly relied on the importation of African slaves from the Caribbean. Thus, if we look at the Southern society, it started and pretty much remained a slave society that focused on each individual homestead, where the owner of the plantation served as the patriarch, as the ruler over his own little fiefdom. This was very different from the tight-knit communities often developed in New England, where each family acted more as a little commonwealth. So how did British North America fit into the larger Atlantic system? First, they provided transportation. While New Englanders were limited in climate and soil from plantation and commercial agriculture, their extensive forests, artisans, and sailors built and manned quality vessels that shipped goods across the Atlantic Ocean and even the Pacific Ocean. It was in their hulls that deerskins and staple crops from the southern colonies traveled to the sugar islands of the Caribbean. They were the ones transporting goods to African slave posts and returning with human cargo. Second, the British North American colonists were producers of tobaccos, furs, indigo, and sugar, all items produced in southern colonies that found ready markets in British cities. Finally, they were consumers. While early colonists lived modestly, 18th century colonists could participate in the consumer revolution that had begun in Europe. Merchants shipping calico, tea, and spices from India found ready markets in the 13 colonies, as did English merchants selling manufactured goods. Luxury items from East Asia likewise found a population willing to spend money on them. Finally, the Atlantic system and growing colonial population changed the landscape as it increased urban centers. When the first British colonists arrived in the early 17th century, they mistakenly believed that it was empty land, or terra nullius. They did not understand that native peoples had lived there, that they had changed the land, and that the land that they were gazing on was actually a cultural landscape carved from the environment by native communities for thousands of years. But their land use and village structure was different. During the medieval ages, Europeans adapted farming practices that distinctly separated fields based on crop and usage. Their 3-rotation system kept 2 crops under the plow in each season, and 1 remaining fallow for livestock and soil building. In other words, they carefully delineated the land based on individual ownership and usage, as well as different types of crops. Native communities, on the other hand, did not adopt monoculture in their fields as they practiced intercropping and intertillage. Instead of separating corns, beans, and squash into separate fields, they planted them in one. a practice that retained nutrients, maximized the harvest, and prevented erosion. Historians have records of colonists mistaking native fields as overgrown with weeds or disorganized. According to the native eye, they were very organized, and they were divided based on individual families' usage. Native American villages also confounded Europeans. European settlement patterns were distinctive to their history. Their long lot survey practice produced settlements that were stretched out along a river or a trade route. They transformed the landscape by constructing stone walls and bridges. These were the signs of occupancy for which they looked. Native people had also transformed their land with palisades and longhouses, especially in the northern forested areas and parts of the south. But they also had spaces divided into areas of family and community needs. But Europeans dismissed this architectural style, as well as the village layout, as temporary and unorganized. So as we can see in this picture, we have Philadelphia on the left and Savannah of Georgia on the right, each one carefully laid out along the gridded pattern that the streets of Europe were the societies of Europe were so fond of. And as European colonial settlements grew and expanded, they surveyed the land and they divided it based on their cultural needs, based on their cultural experiences. The gridded streets of Europe were replicated in Pennsylvania and other colonies and would continue to spread westward with American settlements. Initially, the older systems of meets and bounds and long lot surveys were commonplace within the colonies. The system of meets and bounds could also be argued as a very unorganized system of agricultural surveying, in which distinctive landmarks are used to pinpoint the boundaries of one field or another. Long lots, on the other hand, distinctively traced back parcels of land in close-cut patterns with neighbors bordering neighbors, oftentimes with a trade route or a river or some other physical feature cutting through it and providing transportation. Following the American Revolution, this was replaced by the town and range system. The town and range system introduced the gridded system, in which one point began the first range of a survey area, each range being organized in succession to that first one. Ranges were then subdivided into townships, each township being 1 square mile in size. And it was these townships that were further divided into sections, half sections, quarter sections, half quarter sections, and so on, with one section being retained for a school. The idea being that they would replicate Republican society through education. It was this gridded system that the United States later unrolled like a carpet across the landscape of North America, often erasing the indigenous cultural landscape in the process. In conclusion, the European colonies were established with one purpose in mind: to provide raw materials for the use of their colonial cores, of their imperial cores. Over time, as colonial societies stabilized and as they grew, they began to strain against this mercantilist pattern, this mercantilist system. By the end of the American Revolutionary War, they desired a new economic system in which they could compete as equals within this globalizing economy. As this economy developed within the British North American colonies, it reshaped the land around them and the way that the land was used, oftentimes commodifying it for an increasingly industrialized process that started in Europe and would later spread to the United States of America. As they did so, they changed the cultural landscape from one created by the Native Americans thousands of years before them to one more accustomed to the streets of Paris or London.